Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Mitzkel. I'm happy to welcome you to Columbia University to a conference that we are holding today and tomorrow on dealing with the past in East Central Europe. It's a subject that comes out of our involvement with two foundations, one in New York, one in Warsaw, the Kościuszko Foundation and the Semper Polonia Foundation, which support some of the things that we do at the East European Center that deal with Poland. The topic was part of a series of events that we had been thinking about for quite some time. And frankly, when we began to think about it, there was a different government in Warsaw, one that would be pursuing some of the things we're going to be talking about a lot more energetically than the current government will. And as we began to think about illustration, about the politics of history, about historical justice, we began to contextualize it. So in the Polish case, we thought a little bit about how important the dialogue was between Poles and Ukrainians. Just last May, on the 2nd, 3rd of May of this year, we had a conference on Polish-German reconciliation, which is an ongoing process, just as Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation is. And then we started to think about what happened in other countries. We started to think about lustration in Germany, so the Wessis lustrating the Aussies. We thought about what happened in the Czech Republic, what did not happen in Hungary, and what is just beginning to happen in Romania and in other countries. And of course, the whole issue of justice in transition is something that each country is experiencing, just as each country in Europe and elsewhere is looking at its own history very differently, which led us to a series of questions about how Germans are beginning to re-examine themselves as victims of the Second World War and not as the people who started that conflict. We were beginning to ask questions about state policy in the area of education, which is something I hope that we pursue today and tomorrow. To what extent should a state like Poland mandate education in the form of looking at, for example, heroic deeds like the battle at Westerplatte in September of 1939 and the Warsaw Rising in 1944, vis-a-vis Jedwabne, the tragedy at Jedwabne, and a different way of looking at the Warsaw Rising in 1944. To begin our exploration of some of these topics, we turned to Professor John Elster, who teaches here in the Department of Political Science at Columbia University, where he is the Robert K. Merton Professor of Social Sciences. Professor Elster has a lot of books to his credit, one of which is of particular interest to us here, which is called Closing the Books, Transitional Justice in Historical Perspective, which was published 3 years ago and was something that Professor Elster had been working on with a team of people here at the university for years before. And this evening he's going to begin our conference with a discussion entitled Reflections on a Transition, and frankly I can't think of anybody better to tackle the topic. Professor Elster.
Thank you, John. Let me start by saying that as a non-specialist in an audience of specialists, I feel slightly intimidated. So I have to beg for your charity and indulgence, which does not mean that you should spare your criticism, but charitable criticism. Now, I'm going to present some mainly quite personal reflections on the transitions that took place in almost all communist countries around 1990. I'll mainly talk about Central and Eastern Europe, which I know best. I will also refer to the Soviet Union and briefly to China and to Cuba. Some of the talk will be just personal reminiscences, but some will be about transitions, these transitions in general, and some more specifically about the topic of this conference, transitional justice or dealing with the past. Mic closer? Well, then I'm... Okay, we'll see. because then I have to be able to read my manuscript. So, how is this? Better? Okay. Now, of course, the issue of transitions and the issue of transitional justice are related in many ways, notably because the features of the transitions shape the modalities of transitional justice itself, a topic to which I will return several times. Now, I've been thinking about this for some time. I wrote my first article on topic in the London Review of Book on January 25, 1990. And this was more or less in the middle of transition, but the dust had settled enough for it to be possible to see the way in which things were moving. The title of that article was When Communism Dissolves. Maybe it should have been When Communism Implodes. Then later that year, in June 1990, I invited myself to a conference that I heard was going to take place in Pécs, in Hungary, on institution building in the new societies, in the new regimes. And at the conference were, among others, Viktor Oshatinsky and Andras Shayo, and I was immediately struck by the depth of their insights. At the conference also, by a lucky accident, was the Dean of the University of Chicago Law School. I was teaching in Chicago at the time, Gerhard Casper, and I asked Gerhard, well, what about creating a center to study these ongoing constitutional developments? And he said, sure. I often wish that my institution here was had the same mode of flexible and swift decision-making. Now, when I came back to Chicago, Stephen Holmes, who is now at NYU Law School, Cass Sunstein, who remains at Chicago, and I created a Center for the Study of Constitutionalism in Eastern Europe. Our first task was to recruit collaborators to the center in the former communist countries in Eastern Europe. So in the winter of 1991, Stephen Holmes and I traveled around Central and Eastern Europe to Prague, Sofia, Bratislava, Belgrade, Zagreb, and Ljubljana to locate suitable collaborators, and mostly with success. There was one poignant case in which a person accepted to be our collaborator, but then a week later wrote to us that after your visit to me, I had another visit, so I have to go back on my commitment. You can probably understand why. 10 years later, I met him again. He was then a very prominent academic, and he said he was very ashamed of what he had done. And I said that was ridiculous, because, of course, there was no reason why he should put his collaboration with us ahead of his own personal security. Well, I could go on like this, but I won't. There was a lot of traveling in those years, mainly related to constitution making. But of course, when we talk to politicians in a region, the issues of transitional justice always came up. So in a way, indirectly, I was preparing myself for the book that John mentioned that I published some years ago. One thing I've been struck by ever since was how the transitions in Eastern Europe constitute a massive failure for the social sciences. Essentially, nobody predicted the rapid and total collapse of communism in the region. There were some exceptions, and it would be interesting to try to identify them and see if they were right for the right reasons. For instance, I remember that in 1978, Hélène Kerr-Dancos wrote a book in which she predicted the downfall of the Soviet Union, or the breakup of the Soviet Union, due to ethnic tensions. Well, she was right about the downfall, but I think wrong about the cause. Now, another failure was even more striking that appeared a couple of years later. I think that in the years of 1989, 1990, and 1991, to my best knowledge, not a single person anywhere predicted the rapid return of communists to power in the region, communist governments and communist presidents. And when I reread my article from 1990 in the Non-Review of Books, I find various expressions of skepticism about reform, but not a single hint that the communists might actually have a comeback. And I'm happy to be corrected, but during my years traveling at that time, I don't think a single person brought up this possibility. And I think maybe we all were under the sway of a false analogy from the post-1945 events, when, of course, National Socialism was eliminated completely as a political factor. So maybe we thought just axiomatically that communism, too, would be completely eliminated. Well, I don't know what the explanation was, but I think the facts are clear. And let me just mention that in this respect, the transitions of 1989 fall into the same pattern of as various other world historical events. Essentially nobody predicted the independence of the American colonies, and essentially nobody predicted the French Revolution. There are exceptions. I can cite a couple. In 1765, the King's Minister Choiseul in France predicted American independence. And in 1770, Turgot's advisor, Abbé de Véry, predicted very firmly the French Revolution. But these were exceptions. So by and large, these came as a total surprise, only inevitable in hindsight. Now, let me take a smaller, perhaps more interesting example of the difficulties of prediction, related to a crucial stage in the transition, maybe the very beginning of the transition, namely the elections in June 1989 in Poland. I think at the time, I think the sweeping victory of the opposition, of Solidarity, in those elections were perhaps the decisive event in the whole sequence of transitions. And totally, utterly unpredicted by the regime, which would never have accepted elections if they had predicted defeat, by Solidarity, and by outside observers. The highly respected and well-informed Louisa Winton wrote in Radio Free Europe on March 20, 1989, that the need for the government to win some of the free seats in the Sejm to override a veto of the Senate was, quote, likely to be more important in principle than in practice, because the communists, in fact, would only have to get 8 out of 161 free seats to override a veto by the Senate. But as we know, they did not get a single seat. And I remember vividly when this happened, and I told myself, this is the beginning of the end. And then I remembered that I heard that phrase before, 20 years earlier, but forgotten it. When I was doing my dissertation work in Paris around 1970, my dissertation supervisor, Raymond Aron, reacted to the news about the uprising in Gdansk in December 1970 with that very phrase, this is the beginning of the end. And of course, he was right, but maybe not for the right reasons. Aron had a very strong record of prediction. Among French intellectuals, he was the only one who said strongly and ambiguously, as early as 1957, that Algerian independence was inevitable. And I'm not sure he diagnosed the reason for the collapse of communism correctly, because, as I understand those reasons, they were largely related to the massive economic inefficiency and wastefulness of those regimes. So maybe Aron and Pereira Dancos got it right, but maybe not for the right reasons. Now, let me just insert a brief, irrelevant aside about Cuba to show the difficulties of prediction. I went to Cuba for a short visit with a colleague, Adam Przeworski, in 1994. And when I came back, I wrote up a report predicting the imminent demise of communism in Cuba. I said that intellectuals and the elite in general were engaged in what you might call a calculus of dissent. choosing the optimal moment to show their colors, late enough to avoid punishment and early enough to escape the charge of opportunism. Well, that may have been true, but the regime still seemed to be hanging in. So let me move away from these anecdotes and try to say something more systematic about transitions. And I'll organize my remarks in 7 points, 7 features of these transitions in 1989, 1990, 91 in Central Eastern Europe and to some extent in the Soviet Union. First, we must never forget, I think, the unique nature of this transition. Communism was, you might say, a 70-year-long parenthesis in world history. It was closed in 1989 or 1990, and I think it's relatively safe to predict that it will never be opened again. It may be the most radical regime change in world history. When a dynasty falls, another dynasty, more or less like it, takes its place. When a fascist or authoritarian regime falls, that doesn't prevent another such regime from rising later in another country or even in the same country. When a democracy falls, that doesn't imply the fall of democracy. But in the case of communism, defined largely through central planning, I think the demise is definitive. It's hard to imagine that anyone would ever deliberately adopt this wasteful, inefficient system again. Now, given what I just said about difficulties of prediction, I might, of course, be wrong, but it is at least beyond my powers of imagination. Now, the second point is the need to distinguish transitions to democracy and restoration of democracy. The dynamics in countries in Central Europe differ from those of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, in which democracy and the rule of law had essentially never existed. So this is one reason why, let me see, I think I've got my, let me see. I think I actually must have deleted one of my points, but that's okay. Okay, so maybe I should back up a little. One of the difficulties of prediction has to do with the fact that we can observe what the transitions are transitions from, but we do not know yet for some countries what they were transitions to. So we know in Central Europe that there were transitions to market economies and to democracies. But you do not really know what is going on in Russia or in China. We know that there are transitions to market economies, but we cannot really predict the outcome of future political developments. You know, when Zhou Enlai was asked what he thought about the French Revolution, he allegedly said it's too early to tell. And similarly, it may be too early to tell what the political long-term equilibrium effects of the transition in the former Soviet Union will be. But I think one reason it's so hard to make that prediction is that, as I said, there had never been democracy and the rule of law in the Soviet Union, so these institutions could not serve as a focal point to which to return. Everything has to be invented from scratch. Now, a third point, which has often been made, is that these transitions were almost unique in regime changes in that they occurred virtually without any violence. It wasn't just the Czechoslovak transition that was a velvet revolution. The same was true of all the countries in the region. There was no street fighting, and except for the execution of the Ceausescus, there was no wild justice. It is rumored that the German Democratic Republic contemplated using violence in imitation of the so-called Chinese model from Tiananmen, but the fact is that they didn't. And perhaps the East German leaders were afraid that soldiers would not obey orders to fire on the crowds. And this lack of violence during the transition was matched by lack of violence prior to the transition. Although there were, of course, oppositional or dissident movements, more or less organized in all the countries except for Romania, there was no armed underground resistance, no assassinations of officials, no sabotage. The uprising or confrontations of 1953, 1956, 1968, and 1970 were not the work of an organized underground opposition. And one interesting implication of the lack of violence for transitional justice is that there has been no reason to ask whether the purges or the punishments should be even-handed. That is, as in South Africa, where both the ANC and the regime have been, both members of the ANC and leaders of the regime have been brought in before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because in the region we're talking about, all the atrocities were committed by one side, by the government. So the question of even-handedness never came up. A fourth remarkable feature of the transition that I remember very vividly following, as we all did, day by day, week by week, was the snowballing that took place within countries and across countries. The transitions in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria happened in a cascade, each one of them shaping expectations in the next one. And the build-up of street demonstrations in Leipzig on successive Sundays in October 1989 also had a snowballing pattern, although I'm sure the underlying mechanisms were different. And I think this is another challenge to the social sciences. We don't quite understand this phenomenon of, we could call it contagion, imitation, snowballing, technical language, some will call it Bayesian updating, but we don't really understand it. Another instance was the diffusion of the French 1848 revolution, first to Germany, and then throughout Europe. Exactly how does this happen? It's an interesting challenge, and I think we don't quite understand it. A fifth observation, which is a bit more speculative, well, the fact is not speculative, but the explanation, I'm going to suggest, might be a bit speculative. The fact is that at the same time as the transitions took place, all the federations in the region broke up in Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. And this is must be more than a coincidence, but I do not know whether it simply was that all the breakups of the federations had a common cause, that is the downfall of communism, or whether some kind of snowballing effect might have taken place there as well. Well, as I said, this is speculative. A more complex conceptual point concerns the coexistence of transition and continuity. Making a clean break with the past is difficult if in making the break one employs the methods and a conceptual framework of the past itself. And let me just give one illustration from the satirical work of Alexander Zinoviev. Zinoviev observes the following, that until 1953 in the Soviet Union, it was obligatory to mention Stalin in all possible and impossible contexts. Then there was a brief period between 1953 and 1956 when it was permissible not to mention Stalin, and then after 1956 it became obligatory not to mention him. And Zinoviev claims that this confusion, or this inference from that whatever is not mandatory is forbidden, is a peculiarly Stalinist mindset that was employed in the process of de-Stalinization itself. And I believe Václav Havel was warning against such hidden continuities in his famous mantra, "We are not like them." Well, sometimes the new regimes, were like their predecessors. In the Czech Republic in particular, it seems to me that the desire for revenge against those who had violated the rule of law in the past was sometimes stronger than the respect for the rule of law itself. Another hidden continuity is found in the insistence on positive rights and welfare rights in many constitutions in Central and Eastern Europe, although these clauses may have been inserted as make-believe concessions. They have on many occasions been used by constitutional courts to strike down legislation. Another such hidden continuity can be seen in processes of restitution, where in Romania, and I think maybe also Bulgaria, for a while at least, there was a limit on the size of land that people could receive as a result of the process of restitution. Clearly a legacy of the egalitarian ideology of the past. And a final, maybe more obvious, probably more important form of continuity is the survival of the nomenclatura. In some countries, the persistence of communist-trained judges and prosecutors has been a serious obstacle to transitional justice, just as the persistence of Nazi judges was in Germany after 1945. So what these remarks add up to is the implication that the continuity of with the past may cause transitional justice to be either more severe or more lenient than would otherwise have been the case, depending on whether there's a desire for revenge or whether the survival of the old communist judges and prosecutors turn out to be the most important. So my last point was actually one that I made a bit earlier, because I got mixed up in my numbering of the points, namely that transition is not just transition from, but also transition to, and that often in these cases, and some of them, we do not know what there is a transition to. And I would like to quote something Tocqueville wrote in the 1850s. He said, "I have already heard it said in my lifetime on 4 occasions that this new society made by the revolution has now finally found its natural and permanent form. 4 times events afterwards proved that people were wrong." So in Russia and China, I don't think we have the faintest idea of what will be the natural and permanent form of the new political system. The dust is very far from settled. And I'm going to make a similar point with respect to the main topic of this conference, dealing with the past. So let me just summarize the tasks that the new regimes faced after transition. There were 2 forward-looking tasks, building a transition to a market economy and building a constitutional democracy, and 1 backward-looking task, transitional justice, retribution, purges, restitution, compensation, and so on. Now, the need for the forward-looking, or the importance of the forward-looking tasks was obvious from the beginning, but the need for the backward-looking task was not obvious. And here I can just testify on the basis of my own experience by citing from the notes I wrote up for myself, just for my private use, after the Pech conference in 1990. Here's what I wrote. Several politicians present at the conference agreed that retribution should not be carried out, except against those who had committed clear criminal acts such as torture. The Spanish solution of complete amnesty was the only workable one. The injustice inherent in amnesty was the price one had to pay for democracy. Later, I'm still quoting, the issue of rectification, giving back property to those from whom it had been confiscated, was raised. Again, the general tendency was to argue against this form of backward-looking justice. So this was in June 1990. I do not know whether this was representative or not, but at least that's what we heard. And the word, the Spanish model, was certainly very frequently used, the phrase, the Spanish model. But as you know, this is not how things turn out in most of the region. In Poland and in Hungary, the Spanish model was held up as something to imitate for a while, but except to some extent in Hungary, this did not last very long. But here is another failure of prediction. If we go back to the early 1990s or mid-1990s, I do not think anyone would have predicted that retribution or lustration would have been a live issue in Poland in 2007. Because I think we all were under the impression that these emotions, the desire for revenge, would fade with time, as many emotions do. But we learned from Eastern Europe and from Argentina and Chile that, in fact, these emotions can remain very strong for decades now, going on almost, in Argentina, actually more than 20 years. In Chile, almost, and Eastern Europe, almost 20 years. So that was another prediction that nobody made. We thought that if there was going to be transitional justice, it would be swift, over and done with, and then move forward. As what happened after 1945, well, that's definitely not what has happened, well, at least in Poland, to take the paradigmatic example, as John mentioned it. Let me step back a little bit to review my own thinking on a topic at a time, what I recommended on normative grounds. I had a discussion with Herman Schwartz about retribution and compensation. And Herman argued, I think, quite vigorously for quite strong retribution and generous compensation. And I argued against him, saying that the big fish will probably be hard to catch, punishing only the small fish will be unfair, and that compensating everybody when everybody had suffered would be like asking people to take in each other's laundry. And Herman said that one should at least do what one could. So I published an article in East European Constitutional Review in 1992 called Doing What One Can. That is also partly reprinted in the first of the 3 volumes on transitional justice, edited by the U.S. Institute of Peace, where I essentially said the following. Because nobody was innocent, nobody should be put on trial. Because everybody suffered, nobody should be compensated. The dispensing of retributive and compensatory justice makes sense only on the background of an otherwise orderly society. At the very least, prosecutors and judges and officials must come with clean hands. These conditions are not satisfied in the former communist countries. Well, I still more or less believe in these propositions, with exceptions, to be sure, of torturers, their victims, and probably some other categories of individuals who gave orders to shoot, to kill. But anyway, this is not how things worked out. In the Czech Republic and in Poland, maybe other countries too, lists of alleged collaborators with the security police have been posted on the internet, numbers of individuals ranging, I think, in the 5 or maybe even 6 figures. I wonder how many killed themselves when they found themselves on those lists. I have only one example, which is in the spring of 1998, an unknown organization in Lublin, in Poland, published the name of 119 persons who had allegedly cooperated with the militia before 1989. and 2 of those named individuals subsequently killed themselves. Now, what I've just said... No?
No. No.
Well, there is a Polish sociologist, K.U.C. Cook, who has published a book in French on this, which I've read, and he claims that.
It's interesting because it's in French but never in Polish. But I've had a lot of time about suicide committed by this, but I was searching for it about 17 years, and I haven't found any examples.
Well,
maybe I have to search more.
Well, I tried to verify the credentials of Mr. Cook. He seemed to be a bona fide scholar, so I took his word. Maybe I shouldn't have, but I cite him in my book on transitional justice. But it was published in French, written in French, I believe. So, well, let me just say one thing. Shame is one of the most powerful motivators for suicide. Being held up, exposed, even if unjustly, as having committed a shameful act is a very strong inducement to suicide. And I can cite many examples. And, but on a priori grounds, I would be surprised if the publication of those lists did not induce some people who perhaps in some vague way were guilty of something to, or maybe in a precise way, to kill themselves. But of course that's an empirical issue, and of course I might be wrong. Now, what I have just said amounts to what you might call post-transition arguments for leniency of punishment. But then there's another issue on a set of arguments that arise before the transition, because sometimes to make the transition possible at all, you may have to promise amnesty, immunity, or at least leniency to the outgoing leaders. Otherwise, they might not want to step down. And as we know, this is what happened in South Africa. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a compromise because the white government would not step down if they could be expected to be brought to justice. And the processes of transitional justice in Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay were also heavily constrained by the outgoing military regimes. And there have been many claims that transitional justice in Central and Eastern Europe was also constrained by the need to guarantee immunity to the outgoing leaders. And in my book, I cite half a dozen allegations to this effect, mainly relating to Poland and Hungary, but they do not really add up to hard evidence. There seems to be an idea that there was an implicit contract, an implicit tacit agreement that the outgoing leaders would not be prosecuted. A tacit promise which the leaders believed. Well, if there was a tacit promise, and if the outgoing leaders believed it, they made a mistake. Because it's in the nature of democracy that anyone negotiating on behalf of the state cannot make promises for what subsequent courts or legislators or their own successors might do. So even if the left wing of Solidarity said pacta sunt servanda, the right wing of Solidarity did not feel any need to keep the promises made by the left wing. So it's a puzzle to me why the outgoing leaders did not understand this elementary implication of rational choice theory. Now in Hungary, according to my former student at Columbia, John Sheeman, who wrote his doctoral dissertation on the roundtable talks in Hungary, there was another pre-transition mechanism that brought about not exactly immunity, but at least attenuated punishment, which is the following. The Hungarian communist leaders in 1989, September, October maybe, 1989, were quite unsure about what would happen in upcoming elections, the first free elections. So they decided to hedge their bets and try to put in place an electoral law that would maximize their chance of having a majority in a new parliament, but also, in case they lost in the first parliament, to have a constitutional court, a strong constitutional court that could be expected to strike down punitive legislation. And that is, I guess, more or less what happened. It was a far-sighted act on the part of the outgoing communists to create a court that would strike down legislation to punish them. Now, I would like to mention one final point. I've talked for a little bit too long already. The reverberations of the 1945 transitions in 1989. I think there are many complex, interesting links between transitional justice or transitional non-justice in 1945 and the events in 1989. Let me just mention 3 reactions I heard from German friends, or German friends citing what they had heard, among other friends. One was a reaction inspired or motivated by charges that Germany did too little after 1945. Namely, this time we're going to get it right. Another reaction was inspired by resentment that Germany in 1945 was punished for fighting communism. And that reaction took the form of saying, this time we are going to be on top. And the third reaction I heard, which seems to me the most reasonable one, was that it would be unreasonable to impose stricter punishments on communist crimes than on in Germany, infinitely more serious Nazi crimes. But as you also know, in Hungary and in Poland, these two episodes are also heavily mixed up with one another. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Elster. We have time for questions. Professor Kosmodemski. If anybody else would like to ask a question, may I ask you kindly to use the microphone?
Now, my question is concerning the case of Germany, because you mentioned this on the end of your speech, because it's the country which dealt more consequently with the communist past. And my question is, was it not democratic? They put in jail Egon Kranz and so on. And there was also other justification of this move, namely that there are rules of democracy and rules of law applied. As you know, probably nobody in our discipline, social sciences, remained from GDR professor at universities after unification. So this is my question. When you think Germany is a democratic country, why, this strategy you can accept, this kind of dealing with the past, which is, I can say, much more. And the second question is, do you apply your thinking, because we are talking about transition generally, but there are some theories which apply this to, each change from undemocratic regime or totalitarian regime to the democratic one. So would you the same thought apply? And would you advocate the same strategy concerning the transition from national socialism to democracy or not?
Well, I will try to respond. I think the transition from national socialism to democracy, was a transition from an autocratic regime to a democratic one. So I didn't really understand the distinction. In my book, I discussed one case of transitions to monarchy, namely from Napoleon to Louis XVIII in 1815. But most of the cases of transitional justice in history have been following transitions to democracy. There's one other example in the opposite direction, which is what happened in England in 1660, with the return of Charles II and the treatment of the regicides. Now, the first question about transitional justice in Germany is very complex, partly because it was constrained by the agreement reached in the negotiations that only acts that were crimes under both West German and East German law could be pursued. So that was one issue. Then another issue was the way this worked out in practice. I refer to the article by Klaus Offe and Ulrike Poppe in a book I edited that came out last year, Retribution and Restitution in Transitions to Democracy, where they show the infinitesimally small percentage of cases investigated that were actually led to someone going to prison. I'm not really sure whether there was anything undemocratic in German transitional justice. Maybe you could elaborate on the, maybe I misunderstood you, because if you think there was anything undemocratic about transitional justice in Germany after 1989, I would like to perhaps know exactly what you had in mind. I don't think it was a good process. I think the purges in the administration were by and large successful, and that includes, of course, the purges of teachers of Marxism-Leninism in universities. I think that was an appropriate purge. But I think more people probably should have been, like Egon Krenz, sentenced to prison. But as I said, I don't know whether any of these flaws, if there were flaws, can be traced back to any democratic deficiencies. But
it's a slightly different context, but it's very much in the news right now. China. And it's not the subject matter, but it's very interesting. When you consider, in '76, there was a Cultural Revolution, which was sort of close to, let's say, the Paris Commune. It was as close to an egalitarian moment, that one would have had. China now is going through, and I do a lot of work on this in securities analysis, they're making billionaires, not millionaires, in the most shameless 19th century robber baron way. And this hasn't happened in Europe, other than in Russia. And even there, it's sort of somewhat limited. And in some cases, it hasn't even really properly gone forward. In China, it's just going forward massively. And I would just be interested in your reflection of how something like this could be happening. I think back in '76, which isn't a very long time ago, and to see this delta, this extreme delta occurring right before our eyes, and nobody's mentioning much about it, sort of considered fully acceptable and the way things are.
well, the way I understand this question in the present context is the following. Suppose there is a real democratic revolution in China, like as there was, for instance, in Korea some years ago, when former autocrats were held responsible. Could it happen in China that the people responsible for the things, for the actions and outcomes you just described, could be held responsible? I don't think so. When societies deal with their past, the acts they focus on are, well, let me think for a second. Of course, there were German firms or leaders of German firms that were convicted and jailed after 1945 for use of slave labor and other practices. But I would say, by and large, the acts you describe fall outside the normal scope of transitional justice. It might not fall outside the scope of criminal justice, assuming that there's no statute of limitation. But that is a different issue.
I wasn't going to ask this, but you mentioned Germany after 1945. So I'm wondering if you feel comfortable commenting on what happened with Japan after World War II.
In 1945 in Japan, there were first an international criminal tribunal, and then there were separate tribunals organized by the victorious powers. I think the most striking fact, if you compare the Japanese war trials with the German war trials, was the extensive use in Japan of strict liability. The courts did not require proof of what legal scholars call mens rea, that is, intentions and beliefs. So even when a Japanese general was unaware that his soldiers were committing atrocities, and if he had been aware, would have been unable to do anything about it, the mere fact that they were under his nominal command made him liable. So that is what in legal context is called strict liability. It's often used in this country with respect to dangerous products produced by firms. They are held strictly liable, even if no intention or negligence can be proved. So I think that was one main difference. One similarity was that in Germany and in Japan, the Cold War made the whole process diverge, or maybe brought it to a halt. So those were some aspects.
Yes, my question is about your two citations. And the first one was said Zinoviev, that mandatory was mentioned the greatest father Stalin between 53 and 56, I think 1933 and 56, yeah? Maybe in many books he was the greatest teacher, fathers, etc. This is first question.
Which, you talk about Zinoviev?
Yeah, because
this is Alexander Zinoviev, not the first Zinoviev. The second Zinoviev.
Second Zinoviev?
Yeah, the dissident, Alexander Zinoviev, who was a logician, actually a classmate of Gorbachev or his wife.
Yeah, but I am surprised that he didn't know that this started 30s, yeah?
No, but he said up to 1953.
50?
Up to 1953.
Oh, up to
citing, quoting Stalin in all possible and impossible contexts was mandatory. Then for 3 years it was permissible not to do so, and then after 56 it was obligatory not to do so. That's what I was saying.
Okay. And the second question is about this publication on the internet. It was so shameful for some person, they are suicide. We probably nobody heard here about this situation in Poland. And maybe last small question, comment. Of course, illustration is a very old process and was in Imperium Romanum, and legends came from wars. They didn't obey a Roman law. They swear. And in Rome, a legend stayed outside Rome, and the first who broke this was Julius Caesar, and he paid the highest price. And of course, small question, comment, that illustration in Poland was different than in Germany, and was made from outside, by Western prosecutors, and of course, in Poland was the greatest problem, because 40 million people country and about 1 million portfolios. Of course, the greatest and apocalyptic illustration in history maybe will be in China. there will be about 200 million folders. Yeah?
Well, on the question of suicides, it's obviously an empirical issue. I gather that nobody here from Poland or the Czech Republic, if there is anyone, where there was also published a list, has heard about this. I can only note what you are saying, but I will repeat that. Well, let me just give a simple example. In 1996, the French police made a massive raid against consumers of pedophilic material, 6 of whom killed themselves when they were exposed. Well, that was shameful, to be sure, to be exposed as a consumer of pedophilic materials. Wouldn't it be just as shameful to be exposed as having betrayed your friend, your wife, your colleagues at work or otherwise, or been suspected of having done these things? As I said, I'm just thinking from first principles. There are some suspicions that are so shame-inducing that they often lead to suicide. So that's all I can say. And then there are these 2 references from the book by Cook. I can give the exact title here. It is KUK. His first name is Leschers, maybe, L. La Pologne du post-communisme à l'anticommunisme, Paris 2001, in a very respectable publishing house. So he says, after 119 individuals were named, 2 killed themselves. Well, maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong. How can I know? Now, with respect to illustration, purges in the public administration is nothing new. You know, it's, I think, for illustration to be consistent with the rule of law, there are a number of conditions that have to be fulfilled. There have to be a presumption of innocence. There has to be individual proof of wrongdoings, not group wrongdoings. There has to be an appeals procedure, and so on and so forth. Many of these conditions were not fulfilled in Central and Eastern Europe after 1989. But after 1945, in the German-occupied countries, there were purges in the administrations of people who had collaborated with the German occupying power, and in which case these conditions that I just enumerated were in fact satisfied. So that is why I think that Havel's principle, we are not like them, is important because it implies that we treat those who violate the rule of law by applying the rule of law. And you know all, I'm sure, this famous statement by a East German dissident after the fall of the wall. We thought we would get justice, but we only got the Rechtsstaat.
Paweł Machcewicz, 1 short comment and 2 short questions regarding these alleged victims of agents lists in Poland or in Czech Republic. I must say that I tried to follow these problems very closely for many years, and I haven't read about any single person who committed suicide in Poland, in Czech Republic, or in Germany. I think this is a sort of a black legend of illustration. And now 2 short questions. Listening to your very brilliant speech, I had an impression that you say that any kind of retribution is somehow close to revenge. But what about the meaning of revealing the truth and achieving the justice? This is the question not about facts, but about values. And the question about facts is, you mentioned the example of the Spanish model of coming to terms with the legacy of the dictatorship, and you said that this model was adopted in Poland and in Hungary for a brief period of time. How would you comment that this model collapsed now in Spain? And this is 70 years after the end of the Civil War, and this is 30 years after the collapse of the Franco regime. So this is the example of a country where people seek, you can call it revenge or truth or justice, even after much longer time that it happened in Poland and in Eastern Europe.
Well, let me begin with the last question. I think what is happening in Spain today is on a very small scale compared to what we've been talking about. I don't think there has been any call for sending anyone to jail. You know, remember the Civil War ended, as you said, 70 years ago. Any who fought in that war must be in their late 80s or early 90s, or if they are still alive. So I think there must be a question of maybe compensation to victims and their families, or maybe simply recognition of the atrocities. If you look at the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it is often justified by, as the name implies, the desire to bring about reconciliation, healing, catharsis. I do not believe that is a realistic aim. But I think the Commission has done an important job in making it impossible for anybody to deny that these atrocities took place. Because many whites were probably unaware, or only they didn't want to look too closely at what was going on, so they could say to themselves that, no, I don't think this happened, it wasn't that bad. But after the hearings of the Commission, nobody could deny that these atrocities did take place and were, in fact, very bad. And so truth is important, but I don't think it's important to bring about reconciliation. In fact, I think bringing out the truth without justice can make resentment stronger. But it is important for the reason I just indicated. Now, the relation between revenge and justice is complicated. Here is one approach, which doesn't really apply, as I said, to Eastern Europe, but does apply to the German-occupied countries. In anger, if you want to take revenge in anger, the emotion will tend to fade over time. That should predict that the same crime, when tried in 1945, should receive a more severe sentence than when the same type of crime was tried in 1948. And this is what we observed throughout Western Europe. Somebody who has served in a Waffen-SS tried in 1945 will be sentenced to death and executed. Somebody who had done exactly the same thing, tried in 1948, will be sentenced to 5 years of prison, serving 2 or 3, which is an indication that this is not impartial, timeless justice, but at least justice mixed up with a desire for revenge. But of course, then the puzzle is, why did not the emotions fade in Eastern Europe? Well, the Polish case, as we all know, as you all know better than I do, but any newspaper reader would know it, in the Polish case, I'm not sure one can talk about a groundswell of demand for retribution in the population at large, because this was part of a political game among the post-solidarity elites. I do say in my book that Lech Kaczynski was an anti-communist rather than an anti-communist, that he was he used this as a tactical weapon in his struggle in Polish politics. But maybe I'm wrong. But so I think in these cases, well, there are 3 different things. There is the desire for substantive justice to be made. There is the desire to respect the rules of procedural justice, and there is the desire for revenge. Now, the conflict between substantive and procedural justice is brought out by the quote I just gave. We thought we'll get the justice, we only got the rule of law. So that's one conflict. Then there's a conflict between justice and revenge, where revenge can lead to excessive severity of punishment, not of the innocent, but of a more severe punishment of the guilty than would be carried out when emotions had faded. So there are 3 different motives and 2 different tensions.
I'm from Germany, as I'm sure you can tell from my accent, and so I would like to say a few words about Germany, but then come back to some of the issues.
Are you by any chance Helga Ben?
Yes, I am.
Admire your work.
Thank you. I think there seems to be a little bit of a feeling, that the West Germans really push the East Germans to do things that they didn't want to do. And I would like to say that while West Germany clearly had interests of its own, it nevertheless was a coalition, really, of very powerful former anti-communists in East Germany, and that the agenda was really set in many ways by the time German unification occurred. And that West Germans sometimes tried to be more lenient and were pushed back, and they didn't want to be accused of being not anti-communist enough. I think it's a complicated issue. I want to come back, and my predecessor asked a question too. In looking at transitional justice, what strikes me about Central and Eastern Europe is, in comparison to what went on at the same time in other parts of the world, like in South Africa, that the issue of what we could call reconciliation or integration or the need to form a political community, that those issues were really downplayed. And I find that strikingly interesting, because it's just one aspect. From the very beginning, justice was always about punishment. And it was really not about, creating democracy can have two ways. One thing is, to bring justice and punish, but another aspect is to integrate, because you want to move forward and you want to create a community. And I think that I would like, I'm interested in your comment. Secondly, I'm afraid I have a few questions, since I have read your work too. I find it also interesting that in the case of Eastern Europe, we mostly talk about what has been called lustration. And you obviously mentioned other aspects of legal administrative measures, and I think it's important. And I have my own ideas why lustration bubbled to the forefront, whereas, compensation and rehabilitation, they take place, but they're not nearly as important in the overall debate. So just your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Well, I'm trying to remember what my friend Ulrike Popper told me, but I think she told me that there were attempts in Berlin to organize meetings of Stasi officials and their victims, if you might call them, the informees, people who have been informed upon, and that these were uniformly unsuccessful, I believe she told me. I think reconciliation must take place at a higher level. And my model for reconciliation, although it may seem perverse to some of you, and especially knowing what happened in Czechoslovakia, was President Havel's decision in 1990 to adopt proportional voting in the first free elections. Now, Havel at the time basically could pick and choose whatever electoral system he wanted. His personal preference was for single-member majority voting, because in that way you would avoid party politics, which Havel thought was demeaning, and you could have the opportunity for the voters to choose outstanding personalities. But Havel decided, on the advice partly of Peter Pietart, his prime minister, to adopt proportional representation to bring the communists back into the political system. Because otherwise they would have been excluded, and there could have been an underground civil war between the winners and the losers, which Havel wanted to avoid by adopting proportional representation. Now, I'm not judging the results of that decision, but the intentions, I think, were right. But it was a matter of reconciliation, not at a personal level, but at the political level. I think reconciliation at a personal level after a conflict of this kind is, in practice, impossible. I'm a little bit engaged in the current peacemaking process in Colombia. And there, I think they have decided that rather than seeking healing and reconciliation, they should send the perpetrators to another part of the country than where they committed their wrongdoings. Because otherwise, to have perpetrators and victims living together side by side is an untenable, unstable situation. Now, the second question, why the priority of purges, lustration, over retribution and compensation in the region? Well, it's first one would have to quantify, to say that, as I said, in the former East Germany, huge numbers of public officials did lose their jobs, very few people went to jail. So in that case, there might seem to be a priority for purges over punishment. But another way of looking at it might be, as I said a few minutes ago, to look at the number of cases that were actually investigated. That was quite a large number of cases. It's just that through the successive filters in the judicial system, more and more cases dropped out until the people who actually went to jail was very limited. But I think at some point at least, there was a political will to punish, but then the will required resources, and there's always conflict over scarce resources. So that's at least how I read the chapter by Offe and Poppe in the book I mentioned, that the political will was there, but it wasn't strong enough to also command the resources that would have been needed to carry out the investigations and the processes properly. Now, with respect to compensation, well, there has, of course, been in the region extensive compensation and restitution. I cite various figures in my book. I hope they are reliable, more or less. I don't know. I wouldn't feel comfortable about saying outright that in the region as a whole, there was a strong emphasis on lustration compared to compensation. Maybe that's true, but I haven't really thought about how to go about quantifying those two things.
I'm afraid we're out of time for the keynote. We'd like to thank you, Professor Elster, for going through half a dozen countries or more and giving good answers to good questions. Thank you.